The night was black all around the campground. Nessie laid still while the Boggart perched on the roof of a car. Inside, Dalman's own Sid slept peacefully, while Annie and Mr. Evett rested in the tents. The clouds blew apart a little, to show a white sliver of moon, and 2 bright stars of the plough. The Boggart sighed, heartrendingly, and from a scrub oak nearby, a barn owl hooted to him in reply. Down through the gap at the top of the window, the Boggart poured himself like water into the back of the car, where the 2 boys lay wrapped in their sleeping bags like cocoons. He hovered over them, longing to share the emotion whirling through him, worries, love of kin, and memories that would not go away. His thoughts flew into and through Almanzo's sleeping mind, like music waiting to be heard. But Almanzo was dreaming of loud yodeling, and could not hear him. The Boggart thought of Annie, but she was in the difficult-to-get-into orange tent. That was how he decided to hover over the head he had originally felt least likely to pick up his signals, Sid's. His rational brilliance, said to be wasted on his decision to become a garbage man instead of going to college when he was older, was likely to provide a barrier to the flickering whispers of no old thing. But there was no barrier. Sid began to dream. He was suspended over the waves of Loch Lynagh, far in the past. He knew it was the past because although this was Loch Lynagh, backed by the outline of Lismore Island and the faint blue hills of the Isle of Mull, there was no sign of Castle Keep. There was only bare rock on which, in the 13th century, the castle would be built. Grass and scrubby bushes grew on the rock, and the waves lapped its edges, and in the waves, 2 glowing, formless creatures played. Smiling, Sid watched the flicker of light as the creatures twisted in the water, and knew they were Boggarts. He had seen that kind of iridescence only once in his life, when the Boggart had shown himself to them in the Mac Evans library. The Boggart darted through the waves to the seal rocks, and the grey seals joined the swift, splashing dance. Sid knew that this was a dream, and longed for it not to end. Castle Keep reared up on the rock, its stones bright and new-cut as they were when first built. He found himself inside the castle, its walls hung with tapestries and lit by smoking torches. He vaguely saw human figures, and knew the Boggart was there, attached to Castle Keep, playing his tricks. These people must be the first Mac Evans, the beginning of the family with which the Boggart had lived for so many centuries. He wondered where the other Boggart had gone. The instant the thought came into his head, he found himself on the ramparts of another castle, bigger and more elaborate, overlooking loch and forested mountains. Beside him were 2 younger children, laughing as water poured into a bowl from a jug held by disembodied hands, and he knew that this was the place to which the other Boggart had attached herself, and this was her family. Across the water, the loch was Loch Ness. So the castle must be Castle Urquhart, which he in the present day had seen only as a ruin of tumbled stone. Sid was overwhelmed by a sense of home, and knew that he was feeling what the 2 Boggarts felt for their respective castles and people through the years. He saw the passing of the centuries, as if pages were flicking before him and carrying the castle with them. He saw other children, in other times, and saw the Loch Ness Boggart changing her shape for them, from a little black cat to a long white snake, to a 4-tin stag, to a unicorn, and then to a huge grey-bodied monster swimming in the loch, with a long neck and a small bright-eyed head. With a terrible noise, Castle Urquhart exploded into a burst of smoke and flame, with stone and wood flying into the loch. Sid shouted. He woke up. Almanzo was leaning over him, gazing down. Sid, you having a nightmare? Screaming like a banshee? You were. You all right? Sid blinked at him, trying to remember where he was. He said. There was a tapping at the rear window, and Dalmanzo saw Annie's freckled face, pale and concerned. He unrolled the window to let her in. Sid saw a ghost, he said. Annie said, I thought one of you was being murdered. Somebody blew up the castle, Sid said. Annie stared. What castle? Castle Urquhart, the one that's a ruin. They blew it up, and she got stuck in the shape she was playing in. And she was so lonely after that. She just slept and slept for hundreds of years. Annie whispered to Almanzo as she tugged her jacket tighter around her pyjamas. I think he's still delirious. I'm not. I'm awake. I'm awake. Sid sat upright, and banged his head on the car roof purposely. She was lonely, don't you see? She just didn't enjoy being awake. That's why she slept for so long. You slept so long. The Loch Ness monster, Sid said. Only she's not a monster and she's not a plesiosaur. She's a Boggart. A Boggart. Just like ours. But... Clumser. Annie nodded slowly, as a dozen swift images of the shape-shifting Boggart danced around her memory. She looked around at the dark campground and the night sky. He came with us, or Boggart, didn't he? Where do you suppose he's been today? I think he's been giving Sid a dream, Almanzo said. In the air around them, so faint that they couldn't tell if it were inside the car or part of the night itself, was a low sound growing, a low warm sound, lapping them with approval, like the purring of a cat. Sid said, and in the minute after the castle exploded, when I was waking up, I had this terrible feeling of how lonely she was down in the dark water, and I really wanted to do something about it. They looked out at the loch. The long gleaming expanse of water stretched before them, and they could see the grey-green mound of the ruined Castle Urquhart in the distance. Annie said, I think the Boggart was putting his own feelings into your head. He hates Nessie being lonely, and he wants to do something about it. Oh dear, said Almanzo. Bogarts and monsters in messages and dreams. This is a sore test for an elderly member of the legal profession. What? Leftover dialogue from another world. Best you don't know, really. The Bogart was slowly circling Nessie's massive, sleeping body like an invisible coronet of floating weed. Nessie, wake up. Come on now, you're not really asleep. You've had enough sleep for 16 Bogarts, these last few centuries. Nessie opened one eye and regarded him mournfully. They blew up my castle, she said. My family went away. That was 300 years ago, the Bogart said. And anyway, I'm your family. You are. I'm sorry, my cousin. Nessie raised her long neck and, with a huge effort, tried to shift her shape from solid monster to insubstantial Bogart. It took great effort, and she was out of practice. First she shrank to a thin monster, like a large aquatic giraffe, then a very small one, like a plastic dinosaur from a cereal package. At last she managed to dwindle completely away, reappearing, to the Bogart at least, as the iridescent flicker of energy that was her natural invisible form. They turned somersaults around each other in the murky water, and the whirling current made by their somersaults rose to the surface, and turned around a little boat sculling across the lake. The Bogart transformed into a sail, and made a figure-8 dive. Don't do that, said Nessie, as she surfaced again. You make me feel so stupid. The Bogart turned back into a Bogart. He said with longing, we could have such fun, if you'd only learn how again. We could go all the way to Loch Lingham Castle Keep. My castle wasn't blown up. We could live here and tease my family, and play with the seals. I can't stay Bogart shape long enough, Nessie said. You could swim all the way there. Now, they made a canal to join the lochs 100 years ago. You can swim from Loch Ness to the Western Sea. This news not only failed to fill Nessie with delight, it enveloped her in such fear that the water all around her chilled. She looked at the Bogart in terror, changed back into monster form, and sank down toward the mud. The Bogart groaned, and dived after her. I look forward to seeing the Great Worm, said Mr. Evett when they explained to him about the Loch Ness monster. He was surprisingly quick to accept that a Bogart had invaded Sid's mind and given him an important message. And tomorrow night the moon is full. Isn't that right, Almanzo? Said Almanzo. Yes, I expect so, yes. He looked at Mr. Evett in bafflement. But, sir, how do you know about? I've known about Bogart since my days in Scotland as a lad. Thought I mentioned it, Mr. Evett said, nodding his head firmly. Actually, I saw it just this morning whiles you kids were still asleep. Got a picture with my camera right here, see. Something made Annie put her right hand into her pocket. She found a little cockle shell she had put there that morning, pressing into her fingers. For an instant, she had an impression that it had summoned her. She clutched it tightly. Mr. Evett was fiddling with his camera. It was there on the screen, I swear it was, he said, looking wildly around him. His distress was so acute that none of them could bear to try to explain to him about the erratic behaviour of Bogarts. We did see it, all of us, Dad, said Sid. A real plesiosaur, humongous, all dripping. It smelled like fish. It was just like the pictures of Nessie, Almanzo said. Yeah, it was. Annie agreed. This is a showerworm, Mr. Evett said merrily. It does not want its picture to be taken. She removed herself from my machine. He scratched his head. I'll have to creep up on the worm one day when she is not looking, and take a picture then. He tossed his camera over his shoulder, and marched off to the outhouse. I'll be right back. You kids, watch for the worm. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Nessie lay sulking, a mountainous heap on the muddy bottom of the loch. I belong here. I don't want to leave. Don't keep on at me. But you're a Bogart. You should be having fun, the Bogart said. With me. Out under the sun and the stars. Out in the air and the sea. Out there enjoying life, not lying here like a blob. He turned an agitated somersault, in a whirl of coal sparks of light. Don't you remember it all? Wasn't it fun turning round the girl in her boat the other day? Don't you remember the old days, playing with the seals? I do. And it was, Nessie said with a glimmer of Bogart mischief. Then she drooped again. But I've lived here too long, my cousin. I haven't the heart to leave. This is my home. She stretched out her huge neck, and laid her head on the mud. The Bogart flittered to and fro above her, a restlessness to glimmer in the cool dark water. He was not used to distress, and happiness flowed all around him, like a murky cloud. He longed to bring his cousin back to the proper life of a Bogart, and he had no idea of what to do. In the deep loch, he whimpered long and sorrowfully. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Listen. Annie peered out over a tangled hawthorn hedge, toward the distant glint of Loch Ness. They had driven back to the campground to pick up Mr. Evett's favourite fishing rod, which he had left in his tent. Listen. Annie said again. Can you hear that dramatic wailing? It's a bird, said Sid, in his know-it-all mood. The greater speckled wailer, native to the west coast of Scotland. It wasn't a bird. Almanzo came to her more slowly and closely, and asked, was it a desperate banshee sort of wail? Yeah, it was a really sad noise. Annie gave her head a shake. There's something complicated going on. Sid chewed his thumbnail. Why did our Bogart give me the dream? I know it was him. And where is our Bogart? Almanzo said to the ear, Bogart, are you there? Kyle Thune Sin. They looked around, at the wind-blown trees, at the cloud-patched blue sky, but found no answer. I don't know what that wailing was, but it was really distressed. Annie said, I think he wants us to go to Castle Urquhart, Sid said. It was Nessie's place, and he wants us to go there, but I don't know why. Come on, then, Almanzo said. We can have a picnic in the ruins. Asterisk, 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 whirling in a tiny invisible eddy, the Bogart hovered persistently over Nessie's head. Castle Urquhart, he whispered. Castle Urquhart. Leave me alone, Nessie said. She nuzzled her head into the soft mud. I haven't seen your castle for centuries. Take me there. My castle's ruined. They blew it up. It's not gone. It's still there, ruined or not. Come on, cousin, please. Take me there. Nessie made muffled, snuffling noises of protest into the dark mud that was her bed, and then, with great reluctance, raised her long neck. All right, because it's you asking. But I'm no treat to be with. These days, I'm not good at fun anymore. You'd be happier if you left me on my own. Castle Urquhart, said the Bogart, darting to and fro, visible as a little whirling flurry of phosphorescence in the black water. Come on. Busy as a pilot fish, he swam down the loch, and Nessie lifted her bulk from the bottom of the loch and came after him, driving herself through the water with great sweeps of her powerful flippers. They headed south, toward Castle Urquhart. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk in the little cafe along the road back to Castle Urquhart. It was Almanzo and Sid who were detailed to go in and buy sandwiches. Annie and Mr. Evett had been distracted by a fishing shop, at which they wanted to buy supplies. Mr. Evett got caught up in a long fishing tangent with an old Japanese fisherman who had travelled there with his spoiled grandson. So what brought you and your grandson to Scotland? Mr. Evett had regretted asking after he got a long complicated answer about, to make life more confusing. You see, we're Japanese cartoon characters in an Italian dub, with English subtitles, in an English book about Scotland written by a Canadian being edited by an American pretending to be a British fellow named Fred. As Mr. Evett tried to work this out, he pulled some bills from his wallet and thrust them at Sid. You and Almanzo can go buy us a picnic. We shan't be long. Soon Almanzo and Sid came back, their arms full of paper bags. We bought a lot, Sid said with satisfaction. And brew too. It was a luminous orange type of fizzy drink in Scotland. Soon they were sitting with their backs to one of the ruined walls of Castle Urquhart, eating Scottish tablets and shortbread. They were near the tower, the only part of the castle that remained partly intact. I remember when hearing an old tale that the Bogart used to live in this castle before it was blown up, Almanzo said. An invisible family trickster. But the castle's been a ruin for more than 300 years. He took a long thoughtful drag at the straw sticking out of his bottle of Ern brew. You met our Bogart before we did, didn't you? Said Sid. Yes, your Bogart always tried to get rid of me. Salt in my drinking water, sand in my soap dish, thistles in my bed and spiders on my head. I was always on to him. All his tricks said loud and clear, mind your own business. Why didn't the Bogart like you? Wondered Annie. To tell the truth, said Almanzo, I think I was too clever for him. You, Sid said. No offence, said Annie. Oh, that's all right. I am pretty stupid, Almanzo said. He smiled, and Annie could see the echo of a green face from the depths of an old country. He took a bite of a chocolate biscuit. I found myself coming quite often to this castle, where we sit now, and listening for the Bogart. Sid said, listening. Feeling what he's feeling, Almanzo said. Almanzo ate the rest of his biscuit, got to his feet and held out his hands to his friends. Come with me and I'll show you. If we focus on Nessie, we shall hear what she is feeling. You just have to concentrate. He went to stand in the grass-wrapped centre of the castle. Okay then, said Annie, the Bogart wanted us to come here, you said, and we've come. So what happens next? It's already happening, said Almanzo. Just keep doing the listening. ****. Nessie slowed down and drifted closer to the surface of the water. The Boggart could see it like a glimmering ceiling several feet above them. "My castle's just over that way," Nessie said. "My poor ruined castle." "Take Boggart shape," the Boggart said, "and we'll go up and have a look." Nessie groaned. "I'm tired, my cousin. You've no idea how exhausting it is, hauling all this weight around. I need a rest." "If you'd just practice your shape shifting," said the Boggart in exasperation, "you'd have no weight at all." "A wee nap," Nessie said. "A wee nap, that's what I need." And she closed her eyes and slowly sank, yet again, to the bottom of the loch. The Boggart twirled invisibly in the water, giving a considerable fright to two lake trout who found themselves revolving upside down. He shot to the surface and into the air. Just for the pleasure of flying with wings, he shifted his shape to that of a golden eagle, the rarest and most powerful bird in Scotland. He soared out of the water, and a bird-watching clergyman from Dundee, peering through his binoculars from his folding canvas chair on the bank, was so surprised and delighted that he nearly fell into the loch. He went home and wrote an ecstatic letter to the Times, and for years afterward his sermons glowed with an image of hope and wonder, the great golden eagle that he had seen so improbably fly out of the dark waters of Loch Ness. The Boggart wheeled high the loch, resting on his wings. Far at the northern end of the long lake he could see something strange, a line of boats, spread across the whole width of the loch, moving in unison, very slowly, toward him. Annie shivered, and opened her eyes. She had been lying on her back on the grass, listening to a lark's bubbling song, while the boys went off to investigate the tower. Now a billowing cloud was crossing the sun, and the air was suddenly cool. She sat up, reaching for her jacket, and saw Almanzo and Sid scrambling back over the ruined walls. High above the lark was still singing, but she could see no sign of it. Only a speck that was a much larger bird, some kind of hawk perhaps, drifting to and fro very high in the sky. Sid came skidding down beside her as she pulled the jacket over her head. The air was making Almanzo's skin look very green. He came toward them from the castle's outer wall, folded his legs, and sat down next to Annie on a pile of rock. "He's all right," he said, "but poor Nessie is not happy at all." "That was pretty weird," Sid said slowly. "We sat there, listening, I suppose, and then it was like being inside somebody else's emotions, feeling them as if they were yours, even though they weren't. It's very hard to describe." "Yes, it is," said Annie. Sid said, "So what does Nessie feel?" "Terrified," said Almanzo, "and restless. She wants to change, but she's forgotten how. And she wants to stay, but she wants to leave. Wants to be with her Boggart, but wants to be left alone." He paused. "Most of all it was like hearing someone calling, 'Help, help.' Same with the dream the Boggart gave me," Sid said, showing the two of them together, wanting things to be like that again. Almanzo squatted beside him and passed him the box of biscuits. He said, "The only thing missing is that they don't tell you how to help. But they can't do that because they aren't actually talking. You're just in tune with them," Sid said, intent, trying to remember. "It's like, oh I don't know, it's hard to understand without having it happen to you." Almanzo stood up again. "Well, I am neither a MacDevon nor an Urquhart, so I dare say I am not qualified to understand. I'm neither Scottish or Irish, after all, but only we're Mish." "Don't get offended," said Sid. Annie got to her feet hastily. "I think this is all just about both Boggarts wanting to be together," she said, "and not knowing how, because there's all this space in the way." She looked at Almanzo, who looked back knowingly and said, "I know about space getting in the way, for friends. Maybe there's something we can do to help them be together, if we can just find out what it is." "Look," Annie said. "Look at that." She was staring over the loch, and following her gaze, they saw a great bird come gliding down out of the sky in a long sideways slant, the end feathers of its broad wings spread like fingers. Slowly it coasted to and fro before them, golden, beautiful, coming closer. "It's a golden eagle," said Almanzo. "I thought you could only ever see them up in the hills." "Annie," Almanzo and Sid looked up and around, turning, searching the empty air for any sign they might recognise. "Boggart," Almanzo said. "Is it you?" The Boggart hovered in a whirling invisible vortex of air over the surface of the loch, looking up at the three anxious young faces searching for him. Then he turned downward and called loudly, clearly, sternly, through the cold water to the bottom of the loch. Hundreds of feet below, It was not a call that any but one creature would be able to hear. Nessie, wake this minute, and pay attention. There are friends up here concerned about you, and about me. A long low grumbling sound came drifting up from the bottom of the loch. It'll be those who were trying to reach down at me just now, Nessie said crossly. I want no part of it. A boggart doesn't have friends, except for other boggarts. He has family, the boggart said. You said you were my family, said Nessie, reproachful. So I am, but you were the Urquhart boggart, and there are still Urquharts in this world too. Even if they can't live in your castle anymore. And there are still MacDevons for me. And I can hear my people calling me, and yours calling you. I'm not listening, Nessie said. The boggart lost his patience. Up above the surface of the loch, people looking down from the castle were startled to see a sudden squall churn the water, as if a very small tornado had appeared out of nowhere. But the squall was not weather, it was the ferocious concentrated energy of an angry boggart, leaping in the air and diving down to the bottom of the deep cold lake. Nessie felt it coming, and cowered into the mud. The boggart had had enough. He drove into the muddy bottom of Loch Ness like an errant torpedo, and whirled underneath Nessie's inert bulk and up again on the other side, screeching like a banshee, stirring up a whirlpool of cloudy sediment. Every fish for hundreds of yards around fled in panic. Nessie moaned. You big ungrateful git, the boggart yelled. 300 years you've been lying there feeling sorry for yourself, idle, lazy, wasting all your boggartry. You know what's going to happen to you now. Coming up that loch there's a boat carrying someone tedious and long-winded named Zelda with eyes that can see you, who wants to capture and enslave you, and make your life miserable for every moment of every day from now on. You'll have no peace, there'll be no sleeping sound in the mud for years anymore. You'll be poked and prodded from one end of the loch to the other, with no escape from her tedious voice ever. Nessie moaned, heartrendingly. Marsh runner boggart, the boggart went on. If you're a true boggart you'll come with me out of here, out to the sea. And there are Urquharts and MacDevons who will help you on the way. But there's to be no more skulking around, no more sleeping. The time has come to change, cousin, and you have to do it right now, or those friends up there will leave you here alone. And so shall I? A large tear formed in each of Nessie's big brown eyes, and drifted away in the muddy water around them. I'm sorry, cuz, I'm sorry. Don't leave me. I'll do whatever you tell me. I'll try my best, I promise. What should I do? Asterisk. What's going on down there? Sid said. He peered down at the ruffled grey water, which was still churning restlessly as if a volcano were threatening to erupt far below. I think the boggart's angry, Annie said, staring at the loch, concentrating. I think he's telling Nessie off. Almanzo had the rapt expression of someone listening to music played a long way off. And Nessie's going to. I don't know yet. I can see a sort of picture. I think it looks like a seal. Asterisk, the boggart said, more gently now. We'll help you. We will. I know you have this trouble with the shape shifting. I know it's hard. But you can't stay in the great monster shape, because you have to leave Loch Ness and the deep water. It's shallower the rest of the way. You have to take another shape until we get you to the sea. And we'll help you, your family and mine, and me too. Nessie said tearfully. I'll do whatever you say, cousin. A seal, the boggart said. Be a seal, and I'll be another, swimming beside you. That's a creature small enough to swim from the loch to the sea, and big enough not to be eaten by any other creature. But the shape, Nessie said in panic. I can't keep the shape. You can do it with help, the boggart said. There'll be 3 minds making your picture, helping you keep the shape in your own mind. 3 minds, or 4, or maybe even 5. That's why you must go seal shape, not boggart shape. They can picture a seal, but they can't picture a boggart. He smiled to himself. They saw me once, but there's not one of them could say what they saw. Nessie heaved herself clear of the mud, and up into the water, with a flick of her massive tail. She said nervously, will they really help? The boggart said, come along up, and find out. Asterisk, the clouds were growing thicker over Castle Urquhart, hiding all sign of the sun, turning the sky to a mounded layer of white and grey. The air was chill, and in 2s and 3s the tourists were leaving the castle's romantically ruined tower for the refuge of the bus that stood waiting for them in the parking lot. But Annie and Sid, Almanzo and Mr. Evett still hovered at the edge of the grass-clothed outer wall overlooking the loch, listening. Mr. Evett was telling Annie about the beginnings of Castle Urquhart. It had been built in the 13th century on the ruins of an Iron Age fort hundreds of years older, and Urquharts and their Boggart had lived in it for most of the time after that until 1689. But then there was the Jacobite Rebellion, one of many bloody arguments between the English and the Scots about whether a Scotsman should occupy the British throne. So the English blew the castle up, he said, and it's been in ruins ever since, with Nessie sad in her loch beside it, missing her people, with nobody to play tricks on. Annie said, "No, though to tell you the truth I think she lost her sense of fun long since. Boggarts are gay, flittering creatures. They are not meant to spend so long in one great hulking shape." Sid and Mr. Yvette were sitting together, staring mutely at the water. Then, with no warning, a head broke the surface and rose out of the loch, a head the size of a cow's head, perhaps at the end of a long neck. The neck rose a foot or two out of the water. The head looked at them out of large brown eyes, and then instantly submerged again, as quickly as it had come. Sid and Mr. Yvette yelled, "Nessie!" But by the time the others had looked up, there was only a faint swirl of water on the surface of the loch. "Come back," Mr. Yvette said longingly. "Nessie, come back." The water lay still, but suddenly a small wind blew around them on the edge of the slope, where they sat on the grass-clad rocks above the water. A small wind tugging at their sleeves and collars. A small wind catching up a paper bag from their picnic lunch and blowing it around in a little flurry, like a toy. It was their own private small wind, existing for this one patch of place and time, and out of it a husky voice spoke, a voice that they could hear but that drew no attention from anyone else nearby. "Thward Mere," it said, soft and insistent. "Thward Mere." Everybody looked imploringly at Almanzo. Almanzo said, "I hear you, Boggart. What do you want us to do?" And the voice of the invisible Boggart spoke to them haltingly in Gaelic, for longer than he had ever spoken before, the soft guttural words singing low like the breathing of the small wind, and Almanzo listened and translated for them. And what the Boggart said to them was this: "I shall take her through the water to Castle Keep. I shall swim with her and we shall be in the shape of seals. But she cannot hold her shape on her own. She must have you helping her, you thinking her into that shape. Your thinking must make her a seal, all the way." "Nishan Sin," Almanzo said. "We'll do it," Sid said in a whisper. "Our thinking, our imaginations," Almanzo said. The wind lifted the lock of black hair that lay across his forehead. "All the time they will be swimming down there. We have to see Nessie in our minds, have to imagine this little swimming seal, every minute she is on her way." The wind was still whispering around them. Annie said nervously, "What happens if we stop, if we think about something else?" Almanzo said, "She will turn back into her monster shape, and everyone will know where she is." The wind whispered softly. "When do we start?" asked Mr. Yvette. "Coon," said Almanzo to the ear. "Anis," said the Boggart's soft voice. "Anis, Anis." It grew softer still, as if he were moving away. Almanzo gave a short hiccup of nervous laughter. He said, "We start now." "9 look," Sid said. "Some boats are coming." "What it say on the front?" "Zelda's boat, it says." They followed the direction of his pointing finger and saw a line of boats approaching them from the northern end of Loch Ness. Annie counted. There were 12 of them, moving in parallel, slowly but steadily drawing closer. Watching them, she felt she could almost see the invisible net that stretched below them, sweeping through all the water of the loch. She wondered if Nessie could feel it coming. There was a splash below, and they looked down just in time to see the shining back of a seal turning in the water, disappearing under the surface, rising again 6 feet away. Then the seal's head emerged, whiskered, gleaming, and they saw the big dark eyes looking up at them and knew that it was the Boggart. Beside him, barely visible under the surface of the loch, was the outline of Nessie's enormous body. It was very faint, there under the dark water, and she must have had her head bent, for there was no sign of the long neck or any other part of her jutting out. However, the body was so huge they could scarcely believe they were looking at it. "We have to help her change shape," Almanzo said. "We have to think her a seal." He stared down at the great shadowy mass under the water, trying to imagine it as small and lithe as their transformed Boggart swimming beside it, and so did they all. Sid concentrated on the seal. He could see the seal that was the Boggart. Annie thought hard of the dog-like head, with its liquid brown eyes and dripping whiskers, that had emerged from the sea to gaze at her days before. And Mr. Yvette, smiling a little, made strongly in his mind an image of the fat barnacle-encrusted seal he had seen basking on the seal rocks near Castle Keep. Almanzo did not put his mind to making a picture of a seal, but concentrated on trying to put himself into Nessie's mind instead. He thought, as if he were calling aloud, "Come on now, Nessie, you can do anything you try to do. You're the Urquhart Bogart. Here's the strength of all the Urquharts to back you up. Come on now, Nessie, get out of that monster shape." Buoyed up by all that they were wishing her, Nessie let go of her fear and uncertainty, and all at once her monstrous shadowy form was gone, and instead a second seal was there, swimming with the first. "Oh, well done, Nessie," Sid shouted. This was a mistake. It made Nessie think about what she had done. Her fear came rushing back, and just as suddenly as it had appeared, the seal vanished, and the huge underwater shadow shape was there again instead. "I can't let go," Nessie whimpered. "I can't do it." "Of course you can," snapped the Bogart beside her. "You just did. Change, 'cause everything is change. And you'd better change soon. Those boats are getting awful close to us," Sid said anxiously. "Zelda's boats are almost in range. They'll find her." "Do it again. We almost had it right," Annie said. "We stopped concentrating when she changed. That's what went wrong. Think. They forced their imagining down at Nessie's monster form, a huge dim mass under the grey-green water. Nessie tried her hardest to change, and as they watched, she went through a sequence of the wrong shapes, born of nervousness. For a moment she was a humpback whale, blowing a spout of water. Then just as they were ducking under the shower of drops, the spout died away, and Nessie was a long eel, sliding through the water so fast that they glimpsed the rippling body only as a blur of speed. Then abruptly the movement ceased, and she was an ugly fish, staring at them from under the surface, wide-mouthed and goggle-eyed, a monstrous version of the surviving prehistoric coelacanth. The children and Mr. Evet gazed at the flickering image of the fish, desperately willing it to change. "Be a seal, Nessie," Sid whispered. "Be a seal." Zelda's survey boats crept down the loch. Her research assistant in charge of the leading boat, a red-headed Irishman named Scooter, peered at his sonar screen, seeing for a moment a suspicious-looking mass. Then suddenly, the mass was gone. "Sonar 3, said Scooter swiftly into the microphone that connected him to Zelda Heap in the control boat, further back, had a sounding at 2 o'clock, near the surface. It was the sound of a wild beast, a beast so ferocious, it would make anyone want to quit and go home. He stood up, looking through his binoculars, and shook his head in disappointment. "Nah, never mind then. It's just a couple o' seals." Ahead of the boats, 2 of these great animals were playing once more in the water below Castle Urquhart. Nessie dived underneath the Bogart and came up, blowing happy bubbles. The Bogart dived in turn, rolling over, playing with his cousin, but gradually leading her down the loch, away from the probing sonar of Zelda's fleet of boats. "Quick," Almanzo said. "We have to follow them. The road runs right along the loch. We can be with them all the way till here, safe in the canal. But don't stop concentrating. Keep the seal shape in your minds. Don't talk. Don't even think of anything else. If she loses the feel of you helping her, she'll fall back into monster shape faster than a barefoot jackrabbit on a hot greasy griddle in the middle of August." In silence they hastened to the Evet's red truck. In silence, Mr. Evet unlocked the doors and Almanzo, Sid and Annie tumbled into its back seat. Almanzo slipped into the front passenger seat, eyes half closed, concentrating as fiercely as all of them on keeping the picture of the 2 frolicking grey seals vivid and alive in his mind. Trying desperately to drive safely, while mentally seeing seals, Mr. Evet steered them through the groups of wandering tourists, swathed now in parkas and Macintoshes against a beginning soft rain, and out onto the road. "Come in Sonar 3, said Zelda hopefully into her microphone on the parent research boat. "Sonar 3, anything else on your sonar now?" "Just seals," said Scooter's voice faintly from the loudspeaker, in a dispirited crackle, "and a few fish diving out of their way." Asterisk, 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 with the power of 5 imaginations, buoying her up, Nessie swam confidently down the lake, revelling in her sleek lithe body and the contentment of being with the Bogart. "This is wonderful, cousin. Keep it up," the Bogart said. "You're a great little Silky. You're doing just fine." From the car, Annie craned her neck out the back window and caught sight of the 2 gleaming bodies rising for a moment between choppy waves. The wind was picking up as the fine rain grew heavier. Mr. Evet had his windshield wiper slowly flicking to and fro. "I see them," Annie said. "They're right down there." She strained to see more, but a patch of trees was in the way for a while. Sid's eyes were tightly shut, his face wrinkled with effort. "Concentrate, Annie," See them in your mind. Dutifully, Annie closed her eyes. The air inside the car was tense, prickling with effort, like a circus tent where 5,000 people are holding their collective breath, willing an acrobat not to fall off a high wire. Coming in the opposite direction on the road from Fort William to Inverness, a small white ice cream van was bowling along, on its way to the Castle Urquhart parking lot. Michael, the white-haired former postman behind the wheel, was looking forward to a good crop of hungry tourist children. The Castle Urquhart gift shop sold ice cream too, but Michael felt this was ice cream of an inferior brand. He was confident he would get a great popular welcome when he parked illegally just outside the castle gate, honked his horn, and switched on the loudspeaker that would send the jingling strains of "Will You No Come Back Again?" blaring through the parking lot. Just the thought of it made him reach down instinctively for the switch. In the moment that his hand was off the wheel, a car ahead of him braked sharply to avoid hitting a sheep that had ambled foolishly across the road. Michael caught his breath, braked, swerved, and on the greasy wet road surface his lightweight van skidded into the oncoming traffic on the other side. With a nasty crunch it hit the right front mudguard of Mr. Evette's red truck. Panic flooded everyone inside Mr. Evette's car. In horror Mr. Evette wrenched at his steering wheel, while his foot thrust instinctively at the brake. Almanzo beside him let out a strangled shriek as the impact threw him into the windshield. Annie and Sid were tumbled into a heap in the back seat, and the car lurched sideways and skidded to a stop against a grassy bank. Mr. Evette, knocked breathless by his own steering wheel, struggled to peer around the back of his seat. He saw, to his immense relief, 3 frightened but undamaged faces blinking at him in the blankness of shock. "Are you all okay?" "Yes. I think so. I'm okay." He put his arm around Almanzo, who was gingerly feeling the top of his bleeding head. Almanzo looked at Mr. Evette with eyes that had momentarily forgotten how to focus. Doors were opening in the cars that had stopped on either side of the road, and 2 people were already helping a dazed Michael out of the battered ice cream truck. I'll be filing another lawsuit," he was mumbling deliriously. The side of the ice cream van was crumpled where it had hit the much sturdier truck, and the cover of the side from which Michael made his sales had sprung open, scattering bars and sticks of gaily wrapped ice cream all over the road. A fine rain was still falling, making everyone damp. A fisherwoman opened the truck's passenger door and carefully supported Almanzo as he eased himself out. "Here you come, Henny," she said. "Don't you fret now, everything's all right." "Annie," said, and Mr. Evette climbed out too, on legs whose knees were wobbly. They found Michael wavering toward them on the arm of a solicitous bystander, his face pale and concerned. "Lawsuit," he mumbled again to Mr. Evette. "Lawsuit, lawsuit. I'll have your head." Now, it's not your fault," said Mr. Evette, casually. "We won't bother to take out a lawsuit on you." Annie grabbed a handful of ice cream bars, and gave some to Sid and Almanzo. "Have a scoochie bar," she said. From the road behind, shouts and squeals rose from the cars, stopped in line by the accident. Looking back, they saw people tumbling out in excitement and running, not toward the crumpled van but across the road, toward the loch. They turned their heads, and looked at the loch. "Nessie," Annie gasped. "We stopped thinking. We forgot Nessie." Nessie reared up over the lake. She was an astonishing sight. Her neck and head towered over the nearest of the approaching boats. The top of her body rose out of the water like the side of an ocean liner. For anyone close enough, there was a strong smell of fish and seaweed, like a low-tide muddy beach. The boggart, changed back to his invisible formless self, flittered agitatedly over the choppy grey water, close to his cousin's waving neck. For the moment, there was nothing he could do. Like Nessie, he had felt in an instant the overwhelming effect of the car accident, the sudden total loss of the support that had been giving confidence and form to the little swimming grey seal. Like Nessie, he didn't know about the car accident itself. He had only felt Nessie's utter panic, and known the inevitability of the disastrous second in which she switched back again into monster shape, shooting up over the surface of the loch. He hovered around the dripping hole that was one of Nessie's ears, and hissed at it. "Dive," he whispered. "Dive, cousin." Nessie, bewildered as a lost child, lifted her head with a helpless bellow, bent her neck, and with a sweep of her powerful flippers, dived into Loch Ness. The boggart dived after her. Meanwhile, Mr. Evette and Michael were scribbling on scraps of paper, exchanging names, addresses, and whatever other details their insurance companies would demand. Annie, Sid, and Almanzo were paying no attention to this boringness. They slipped away to stand on the grassy road side bank to stare at the water, willing Nessie the strength to get out of her monster shape. Nessie was 200 feet below them, on her way to the muddy bottom of the loch. She moved blindly, in instinctive retreat, as the boggart whirled around her like an invisible fish unsuccessfully to get her attention. Even Boggart's speech failed. Nessie was in shock. They were being pursued. Looking up, the boggart could see the glimmer of a metallic frame dropping slowly toward them. He paused, and flittered up. What was this thing following Nessie? How could it see her? In this deep water there was no light at all, and fish and boggart saw the world around them either by the light of a phosphorescence they generated themselves, or by using senses other than sight. Did this boat have other senses? Was someone with magic after them? The boggart glowed faintly, from the effort of rational thought, something boggarts are not fond of. He turned himself into a treacly liquid, denser than water, and flowed all over the boat's frame, investigating it. He had seen the ROV above the water, hanging from the davits of the parent boat, and he knew it to be not a creature, but a vessel. But this was clearly no ordinary boat. Flowing over its surface, the boggart could sense a very faint hum, the vibrations of the magic that guided the boat. It reminded him of something he had heard before, a long time ago, something that had intrigued him, and worked great change in his life. What was it? Boggarts have the worst memories of all the creatures in the universe. Hovering there, glowing, the boggart tried to remember. He came to the junction point where a spell that linked the boat to the parent ship acted like a guide to the entire fleet. Because boggarts are made of a collection of electrical impulses of many varied kinds, he easily put himself into the main junction. Once there, he was instantly everywhere in Zelda's system, seeing, hearing and understanding every impulse that came in through the instrumentation, and blocking out any instructions that came from Zelda's switchboard in the parent ship. In effect, the boggart became the fleet's brain. Asterisk, 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 Scotlanders lined the north side of Loch Ness, peering from under umbrellas and rain hats at the flotilla of survey boats. They watched hungrily for the monster. They say it tipped a boat over, and roared like a lion. I never heard of it roaring before. They say it was huge. Bigger than a dinosaur. What do you mean, bigger than? It was a dinosaur. They say the collision was forgotten. The only remaining sign of it was a little heap of melting Scoochie bars lying in the gutter. Michael's ice cream van had limped away, and Mr. Evette's truck showed no wounds worse than some scraped paint and a dent in a mudguard. With the permission and help of an amiable policeman who had stopped to check the accident, Mr. Evett had driven the car onto the grassy verge of the road where no cars were normally allowed. There they all sat now. Hey, Annie, Almanzon said, ignoring traffic and passers-by, thinking of boggarts. Each sat in silence, waiting, hoping, calling without words to Nessie. Down in the mud in the loch below, Nessie stirred, but the boggart was hearing no one. Frolicking through the deep water inside the boat's powerful frame, he was having the time of his life. For the first 10 minutes, gradually discovering the manoeuvrability of the submersible, he played as he did whenever he took on the shape of a seal, diving, looping, speeding through the water, chasing the fish. Help! The boat's gone crazy. Zelda yelled at Scooter, staring at the dials spinning wildly. They were both thrown in the air where they did somersaults and bonked heads. This, however, was only the beginning. The boggart was like a child just let out of school. He had been living under great pressure since he had come to Loch Ness. After a lifetime of self-indulgent freedom, with no relationships, but those based on mischief and trickery, he had found himself caught in a state of constant concern about someone other than himself, Nessie. A sense of responsibility was not something he was used to. It was exhausting. Now he had a toy. He pushed his feelings of responsibility away. Now he could be a boggart again, and play. When he was bored zooming and somersaulting, he poured himself into the other devices through which Zelda's boat controlled itself. The camera came first. The boggart sniffed disdainfully when he found it could transmit only the pictures that it saw. That was something he could put right at once. Scooter, said Zelda nervously, up in the research ship control room. The video screen is doing its own thing now. What's that? Scooter said, staring at it blankly. I think it's a daffodil, said Zelda. A daffodil. A golden daffodil is rare for this location. Now it's a tulip, Zelda said. 5 tulips, all in a row. Pink ones. In quick succession, the screen showed a clump of white narcissus, a close-up of a red anemone, and a bright blue cluster of grape hyacinths. The boggart, down in the cold depths of the loch, was nostalgic for spring. "Now it's a dog," said Scooter. "A werewolf, I think," Zelda said. She gave a slightly hysterical giggle. "Maybe next we'll get a poodle." But all they saw, out of the Boggart's memory, was a horrifying werewolf, with bloodshot black eyes, snarling lips, and the long red tongue dangling over the pointed white teeth. It looked as though it were laughing and wanted to eat them. The werewolf vanished, and the screen was dark. The Boggart, hovering deep inside the boat's controls, had seen a light approaching him through the water. He forgot what he was doing, and zoomed to investigate, and as if he were approaching a mirror, he saw another boat from Zelda's fleet, its twin headlamp beaming at him from a yellow frame. Delighted, the Boggart moved to meet her, but the boat paid him no attention. Her video camera picked him up briefly, then passed him by. With her lights reaching out into the darkness, she sailed on with her quest, the pursuit of a creature for Zelda to enslave. The Boggart chuckled, waiting for her to finish moving around him. Clearly this was some solemn dance performed by the vessels while underwater, a ritual communication. It was rather dull though, it needed a touch of Boggartry. He watched as the boat circled back to the place where she had started, then dived at her. Scooter had no time to work out what to do with the controls. All he saw was the flashing image of the other boats, controlled by the Boggart, crossing and recrossing the water, whirling as Scooter's own vessel spun crazily about. Not in 100 years would he have understood he was in one boat that was dancing with another, to the tune of an old Scottish reel called Highland Mary. The Boggart whirled happily round and round the other boat, singing as he went. He was enjoying himself more than he had for weeks. By the time he finally grew bored, something else had happened that Scooter would never have predicted. In the whirling of his dance around the other boat, the Boggart had bound the two boats' tethers tightly in a kind of braid. Pausing, the Boggart glanced back at the lumpy intertwined line of the two joined cables. He contemplated it, still humming Highland Mary, and giggled. He let out an underwater war whoop, and like two square torpedoes, the two boats took off in the opposite direction of the others. Tourists and Scotlanders observed as they whizzed erratically across the water and collided into a rock. The boat flew into pieces instantly. Whether Zelda or Scooter made it out alive of the wreck is another tale to tell. Asterisk, Annie, Almanzo and Sid looked out over the water, silently calling Nessie. Mr. Evett was doing the same from inside his car. They felt a particular closeness, as if all five of them were a choir singing the same notes in unison. "Nessie, where are you?" "We're here. We'll keep you going, if you'll just get out of that shape and come where it's safe." Mr. Evett opened the car door and got out. He called, "She can hear us. Do you feel it? She's moving. She's closer than she was. I think she's on her way." At once they heard shouts from the loch, and saw Zelda's research ship shoot crazily across the water as if it intended to ram one of the smaller boats around it. They gaped, in an amazed silence. Even in a world where they had encountered Boggarts and monsters, they felt that what they were watching now was unique. Zelda's boat shattered into the rocks and went down along with any passengers that had been inside it. Below, the Boggart, cackling with laughter, shot through the water in his powerful metal frame. Like a thoughtless rider on a roaring jet ski, he caromed through a line of quivering smaller boats, weaving the boat in and out of them slalom fashion, terrifying every crew, but never brushing a single hull. The loch grew choppy with the boat's zigzagging wake. Asterisk, deep in the loch, where she had been listening to the children's silent calling and almost regained the courage to answer their challenge, Nessie lifted her head and sensed what was happening. She could feel the Boggart's joy and mischief, like a once familiar phrase of music not heard for a very long time. She smiled as faint threads of memory stirred in her Boggart mind, and she let her great body drift closer to the surface. All her instincts longed to join in whatever it was that was causing her cousin such delight. But Nessie had changed, since the Boggart first woke her out of her centuries of monster sleep. Now she had a dream, the chance of a life of private gaiety and good company in a quiet place, and her Boggart cousin and his new friends between them had offered her the way to make it come true. Nessie felt, in her creaking, sleep-slowed brain, that this dream must not be put at risk, not at any price, not even for a beautiful piece of Boggartry. The calling of the children made her feel that if she were ever to find the truth of her dream, the time to go was now. She called through the water, in the old speech without words, "Cousin, my cousin, where are you?" The Boggart was whipping Zelda's remaining boats around in a tight starboard turn, just in time to avoid hitting the bank. "Over here," he called gleefully. "Come." "No," Nessie said firmly. She drifted closer. "No, Not now. We have a journey to go, cousin. Oh, later, later, called the boggart. Come have fun, even big as you are. Come over here, come see. He laughed in delight as a group of boys scrambled up the bank to escape the splashing of the boat's wake. The boat roared off again across the loch. Nessie felt a wave of irritation. What about the lectures her cousin had just been giving her about giving up the preoccupation and learning to change? Like a stern teacher, he had dragged Nessie out of sleep into responsibility, and now look at him. Nessie's tail began to twitch, and above the loch a few people noticed the swirling of the water and thought it the ominous precursor of a squall. They were right, in a way. For the last time, Nessie called in boggart's speech through the water. Cousin, our friends are waiting. Come with me. No, shouted the boggart. He zoomed gaily past the bow of the nearest small boat, spraying Michael's ice cream van with water and causing it to break down for good. Nessie uttered a long growl that grew into a roar, casting fear and dread into every underwater creature that heard it. With fierce strokes of her flippers and tail, she shot after the boggart. When she was close to the whirling course of the boggart's boat and its invisible controller, she put down her head and lifted her huge back out of the water. The boat crashed right into it and stopped. The boggart gave a disappointed whine, like a caged puppy. You're spoiling all the fun, he cried. Cousin, Nessie's voice was full of reproach. The boggart paused. There was a small silence. I'm sorry, he said. I'm sorry, cousin. Let's be selkies, Nessie said. She could feel the call from the children's imaginations up on the bank so strongly now that she could hardly bear to wait. Selkies, said the boggart, forgetting his game in an instant. He slipped out of the broken yellow frame of the boat and became a grey seal. The island of Nessie's back vanished, as the head of a second seal rose through the choppy waves to join the first. On the bank of the loch, Mr. Yvette started the engine of his car. The children climbed in to watch the heads of the two grey seals swimming toward the southern end of the lake. They drove down the road, parallel to the loch and the seals. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. By the time their two selkies and their anxious road-borne escorts reached the southern end of the loch, daylight was dying. The fine rain had stopped, but the sky had remained heavily clouded. Now greyness was creeping over both land and sky. They've stopped, Annie said. Sitting by the left-hand window, she was the car's prime lookout to check on the progress of Nessie and the boggart. Mr. Yvette drew the car to a halt, and they got out to peer through trees at the increasingly shadowy loch. I see them, Sid said, by the rocky bit of beach, down below. Almanzo looked at Annie and said uncertainly, They feel, doesn't it seem to you, it feels as though they are tired? Annie nodded. I think they are stopping for the night. But what will Nessie do if we fall asleep? Sid asked. She needs us to keep her in seal shape. She'll suddenly find herself a monster again. Almanzo said with quiet certainty, I don't think you need bother yourself about that. Really? Annie said. She looked curiously at Almanzo's face, which suddenly looked older and wiser than she expected. He smiled at her absently, and then became brisk and matter-of-fact. I think they're probably staying the night in the loch, for that very reason, he said. So that if Nessie does have the misfortune to find herself huge again, there's deep water for her to hide in. From here on, the water won't be near as deep, but every hour she spends out of monster shape gets her closer to being able to shape-shift as a proper boggart should, until she won't need us at all. Almanzo grinned at Annie, and a good thing too. I'm getting tired of thinking about seals, Sid said. I'm having trouble not thinking about food. Come on kids, said Mr. Yvette. I know the way to a campground in Fort Augustus, just up the road. They are sure to sell food somewheres around those parts. He drove them cheerfully away. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Nessie paused swimming, rolled over, and looked back at the grey horizon that was her loch. There was an ache in her chest, a tightness in her throat, and her eyes were hot. She felt this silent, beautiful, ancient lake knew she was leaving, and she wanted to explain. You are a beautiful place, she said to the loch, and I have been very happy in you. Thank you. I'm only going because I have to. I shall miss you. The boggart paddled at a respectful distance, waiting for her. Nessie looked lovingly back once more at the loch, with its wooded hills rising on either side. Thank you, she said to it again. She dived into an underwater somersault, and came up splashing the boggart, and they swam on down the river. Half the day they swam, following the water through the whole great rift that almost cut Scotland in half, running southwest from Inverness to Fort William, through Loch Ness, Loch Och, Loch Ian Loch Linna, from the North Sea to the Sea of the Hebrides. They swam down the river into Loch Och, which was tiny in comparison to Loch Ness, and out again into the next river, broadened for boat traffic into the Caledonian Canal. All the time, Mr. Yvette, Annie, Sid and Al Manzo kept base on the road, holding their minds on Nessie. Whenever they lost sight of the water, Mr. Yvette picked up speed and went on until they found it again. They would park and wait for the two steadily moving dog-like heads to appear around a bend in the river, or through a lock in cautious company with a boat. It was an uneven journey. Partway through the morning they paused for sandwiches and had to make haste to catch up again. Asterisk, 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 I've lost them, Nessie said in sudden panic to the boggart. Their minds have gone away. I feel my shape going. Hold on, cuz if you have to change, try to go to boggart shape. Don't go back. I'm going, but you've nearly made it, the boggart said imploringly. Another half hour and it's a full day you'll have been out of monster shape, and it will do it. After that you can. It was too late. Out in the water of Loch E, one of the grey seals was no longer there, and instead the huge plesiosaur bulk of the Loch Ness monster loomed over them. Water dripped from her towering neck, and the low-tide smell of mud and seaweed filled the air. The loch was not deep enough for her to dive. She stood there belly deep, big as a house. She looked down at the children and made an incongruous whining sound, like a sad puppy. Wow. Almanzo rummaged on the car floor for Mr. Yvette's camera and quickly snapped some pictures. I want to pet her, said Annie. No, Annie, said Mr. Yvette, leave the beast be. Has it not had enough bothering? Just as he said this, the water went quiet and steel grey, ruffled only by a small wind. The seal and the monster were gone. Everyone stared at the empty water, then in the direction they had been travelling. Though they could see a long way up the loch, there was no sign of anyone or anything. Did she turn back to a seal? Annie said. Where did they go? She hunted vainly for some sign of the boggart and Nessie. They must have gone on without us, she said. Let's drive until we catch up. Almanzo came up beside her. Are you sure? He said. No, said Annie. She nibbled at her thumbnail. I can't feel anything about them at all. It's worrying. There was a faint sound over the loch, like the wind blowing in the trees. A car hummed by on the road and was gone. The loch was still, the breeze had dropped, and the leaves hung motionless on the trees. They heard a voice murmuring so softly they could not make out what it said, though Almanzo said afterwards that it was speaking Gaelic. And then they started to fly. They all rose into the sky, slowly at first and then more swiftly. The two boggarts carried them through the air. Out over the loch they flew, and Mr. Yvette's car grew smaller and smaller until they could scarcely see it. It was a smudge against the mounded clouds, a tiny speck in the grand sweeping landscape of purple-brown mountains, dark trees and glinting loch. They held their breaths, caught in wonder. Then just when they thought they could no longer see the car, it grew larger again, coming back as they flew to the shore. They all swooped around in a great arc and came down, arms outspread. A seagull flapping lazily over the loch dived away in alarm. In the next moment they were stumbling up the stony beach that edged the loch, onto the grass again, alight with joy. It was my dream, Mr. Yvette said. When I was a boy, I used to dream I was flying. Up in the sky, like that, lying on the wind, up over the trees and the fields. It was a wonderful dream. I had it 3 or 4 times. I never forgot it, but then it went away. Almanzo said softly. The boggarts gave it back to you again. We're very lucky people, said Mr. Yvette. Now I think it's time to go home. Sid said. I wonder what finally got Nessie able to find her boggart shape. And to stay there. Annie fingered the fossil shell in her pocket, and it moved a little under her fingers, but she said nothing. All the great tricks she and the boggart are planning, probably, Almanzo said. Have you thought what it's going to be like living with 2 of them? Mr. Yvette grinned. When the weather's good, they'll be out playing with the seals, he said. And the rest of the time, they're welcome in Castle Keep, tricks and all. After all, they were around long before the Mac Devon or me. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. It was a bright morning in the Plankers' village shop. Almanzo had gone off early in his boat to take the morning paper to Castle Keep. When he came back, his mother stood at the counter of the post office corner of the shop, checking the weekly accounts. Almanzo went upstairs to get his jacket, and when he came down again, he was whistling. I'm going fishing, he said. I'll bring a couple home for dinner. I hope you'll bring a great many home that we can sell for other people's dinners, said Mrs. Planker. She glanced down at her accounts. Though I must say, we've made more money from your Nessie pictures in the last week than the shop made all year. Aye, said Almanzo noncommittally. He took his fishing rods from a corner behind the counter. Mrs. Planker looked at him curiously. Are you not going back to Loch Ness? She said. The whole world's waiting for the next sight of the monster, and you haven't been here for a week. Oh, I've done my Nessie story, said Almanzo easily. I'll leave it to the rest of them now. See you later. He ambled out, not very excited, even by the Loch Ness monster. After all, real-life bogarts weren't the single most interesting thing Almanzo Planker had experience with. Asterisk later Almanzo, Sid and Annie were perched over the water's edge at the far end of the Port Appin promontory, with parkas and jackets under them against the wet of the seaweed that mounded the rocks. They were watching the choppy grey-green sea and the glistening seal rocks beyond, for a sight of Nessie and the bogart. There, Sid said suddenly. He pointed, and beside the seal rocks they saw a big dark seal swimming. He hauled himself clumsily out of the water onto the rock, and then a second and a third came after him. The third shook his head like a wet dog, and they saw the sunlight glitter on the drops of water spraying from his whiskers. It's not them, it's the real seals, Sid said in disappointment. I still like real seals, Annie said. She shifted a little on the rock, and winced. Oh, Almanzo leaned sideways. What's the matter? I'm sitting on a pebble, ouch. Annie scrambled to her feet on the seaweed-covered rock. She grabbed Almanzo's hair as she almost lost her balance. For crying out loud. He shoved her away. Something stung me. She rubbed the back of her thigh. Sid inspected the seaweed underneath the parka. Can't see anything. Maybe a crab. Annie took the parka and found a small hard lump in it, with a sharp edge that seemed almost to send a current up into her hand. She investigated the pocket. No, it was this. My little shell. The fossil cockle shell lay in her palm, gleaming white in the sunshine. Over on the seal rocks, the biggest seal splashed into the water. His head reappeared, and to their delight and astonishment he swam toward them, crossing the few yards of water that lay between the rocks and their own promontory. The two other seals rolled off the seal rocks after him, but did not follow. They stayed back in the water, watching him. Nosing along the rocky shore, the big seal found a place where he could haul himself up over the mounds of brown bladderwrack seaweed onto the rock. He puffed like a tubby old man, very close to Sid, who sat motionless. The seal was looking at Annie. Annie looked back into the big black eyes. It was like meeting a long-lost friend. It was like talking and talking, though what she and the seal were saying to each other she had no idea. There was prickling in her palms. The seal lurched closer. Now Annie knew what he was telling her. She glanced down at the shell lying in the palm of her hand. Then she looked up, wide-eyed, at Almanzo. The seals helped us, she said. They helped Nessie. They gave me the shell, and so it was in my pocket, and 3 times they made me hold it. I remember now, it was like the shell calling me. 3 maggots, to make Nessie disappear. And I didn't even know. Maybe if you'd known, it wouldn't have worked, Almanzo said. Sometimes that's how magic works. I think now he wants it back. The seal was still gazing into Annie's face. She held out her fingertips with the shell. Almanzo poised to grab her in case she slipped. The seal's cold lips took the shell. He lumbered back toward the edge and slid into the water with a great splash. They all flinched as the water drenched them. Only as they blinked the saltiness away did they see the shimmering in the air around them. It was the blurring of the real world as the old magic moved briefly through it. Through the soft breathing of the waves against the rock, they heard a thread of a voice, or perhaps it was 2 voices. Faint, musical, tap ad-lib. Thank you, Yarkratichan male Rulib. 5 seals were in the water now, swimming and playing. 2 silvery dog-like heads had joined the first 3. They dived and resurfaced, over and over, rolling in and out of the waves. Not Annie nor Sid, nor even Almanzo Planker could tell Nessie and the bogart from the seals. It was that same thing he said before, wasn't it? Sid said, when he showed us himself. Aye, Almanzo said, but this time it was double. Our hearts are with you. The same to you, bogart, said Annie. And same to you, Nessie.